The Whispers Among Tombstones. Chapter 1. The Keeper of Memories. Michael Caine's breath formed small clouds in the crisp autumn air as he carefully trimmed the grass around a weathered headstone. The stone, dating back to 1872, belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Harmon who, according to the inscription, had died at the young age of 24. 47 years of maintaining Oak Ridge Cemetery had taught Michael to see beyond the dates etched in stone. Each grave represented a life, a story, memories that deserved respect even in their final resting place. "Good morning, Elizabeth," Michael whispered, his rough fingers gently brushing fallen leaves from the top of her stone. "Beautiful day today. The maples are turning that deep red you'd have appreciated." Speaking to the dead had become a habit over the decades. Some might find it morbid, but to Michael, it was a simple courtesy. In his mind, the dead weren't truly gone as long as someone remembered them, spoke their names, and tended their graves. At 65, Michael moved more slowly than he once had, but his work remained meticulous. His weathered hands, spotted with age and scarred from countless minor injuries, worked with surprising gentleness as he cleaned moss from the inscription. The cemetery management had offered him retirement 5 years ago, but he had politely declined. What would he do with himself if not this? Who would remember Elizabeth and all the others if he left? The groundskeeping shed where Michael stored his tools stood at the far edge of the cemetery, a small structure that had become more home to him than his empty apartment across town. The walls were lined with carefully organized rakes, shovels, trimmers, and specialized cleaning equipment for different types of stone. A small desk in the corner held a leather-bound logbook where Michael meticulously documented his work, noting which sections he had tended and any repairs that might be needed. Oak Ridge Cemetery sprawled across 30 acres of gently rolling hills, containing over 10,000 graves dating back to the early 1800s. The oldest section, where Michael currently worked, featured elaborate Victorian monuments and family mausoleums. Newer sections contained simpler markers, a reflection of changing times and tastes. As the morning sun climbed higher, the sound of tires on gravel drew Michael's attention. A black car with the parish logo on its door pulled up near the cemetery chapel. A young man emerged, dressed in clerical attire that seemed slightly too large for his slender frame. Michael recognized the new priest who had arrived last month to replace Father Gregory, who had served the cemetery chapel for over 20 years before his retirement. The young priest, Father Thomas, if Michael remembered correctly, seemed uncomfortable among the graves, his eyes darting nervously from stone to stone as he hurried toward the chapel. Michael found this reaction curious. How could someone choose to serve a cemetery chapel, yet appear so discomfited by its primary residents? Michael returned to his work, carefully pruning the climbing roses that had begun to encroach on the Anderson family plot. An hour later, the chapel bells rang, signaling the morning service that rarely attracted more than a handful of attendees, usually elderly individuals visiting loved ones or cemetery workers seeking a moment of reflection. Today, however, the sound of multiple cars approaching caught Michael's attention. A funeral procession wound its way along the cemetery's main path, led by a sleek hearse from Maxwell Funeral Home. Michael frowned. He hadn't been notified of a burial today. Typically, the cemetery office informed him of upcoming interments so he could prepare the appropriate section. Setting aside his tools, Michael straightened his work clothes and moved toward the chapel. As the funeral attendees filed into the small stone building, Michael noticed something unusual. Despite the warm day, each mourner wore heavy black clothing, their faces obscured by dark veils or downturned hats. No one spoke or acknowledged one another, creating a procession of shadows rather than grieving humans. The final figure to enter the chapel paused at the threshold, turning slowly to survey the cemetery grounds. Though Michael couldn't see the person's face beneath their wide-brimmed hat, he felt their gaze lock onto him with unsettling intensity. The figure raised a gloved hand in what might have been greeting or warning before disappearing into the chapel. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran down Michael's spine. In nearly 5 decades of working among the dead, he had never felt truly unsettled, until now. Chapter 2. The Reluctant Priest. Father Thomas Riley clutched his prayer book tightly as the strange funeral procession filled his chapel. 6 weeks into his assignment at Oak Ridge Cemetery, and he still felt out of place. The seminary hadn't prepared him for this posting. A lonely chapel surrounded by thousands of graves, where the living were vastly outnumbered by the dead. He had requested an urban parish, somewhere he could work with youth groups and community outreach. Instead, Bishop Williams had sent him here, claiming that the quiet solitude would strengthen his spiritual foundation. Thomas suspected it had more to do with his questioning nature and the controversial papers he'd written during his final year of theological study. The funeral service was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes, but Thomas had received minimal information about the deceased. The paperwork simply listed a name, Eleanor Blackwood, and indicated she had died at age 87. No family contacts, no personal details to help him craft a meaningful eulogy. Just another name to be consigned to the earth. As Thomas prepared the altar, the chapel door creaked open. The groundskeeper entered, cap in hand, his weathered face solemn. Thomas had seen him working throughout the cemetery but had avoided conversation, finding the man's comfort among the graves somewhat disconcerting. "Father," the groundskeeper nodded. "I'm Michael Kane. I maintain the grounds." "Yes, I've seen you working," Thomas replied, adjusting his stole nervously. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Kane?" "I wasn't notified about today's burial," Michael said quietly. "That's unusual. I like to prepare the ground properly, make sure everything's respectful." Thomas frowned. "The funeral home only contacted me yesterday. Everything seemed rushed. I assumed they'd informed the cemetery office." "Which section is the burial plot in?" Michael asked. Thomas consulted his notes. "Section E, plot 219. Michael's expression darkened. "That's impossible. Section E has been full for decades. Plot 219 belongs to—" He paused, seeming to calculate something in his mind. "That plot belongs to the Blackwood family, but it was filled in 1947. Unless—" His words were cut short as the organ began to play, a somber melody that seemed to make the air in the chapel grow colder. The mourners had taken their seats, their faces still obscured, their postures unnaturally still. "I should begin the service," Thomas whispered. "Perhaps we can discuss this afterward." Michael nodded reluctantly and moved to a bench at the back of the chapel. As Thomas approached the pulpit, he noticed that the mourners did not turn to look at him. Their attention remained fixed on the closed casket at the front of the chapel. The service proceeded with an eerie formality. Thomas recited the prayers, his voice echoing in the cold stone space, but received none of the usual responses from the mourners. When he invited anyone to speak about Eleanor Blackwood, the silence stretched uncomfortably until he moved on. After the final blessing, 4 mourners rose silently to serve as pallbearers. As they lifted the casket, Thomas noticed something odd. They seemed to handle it with suspicious ease, as though it might be empty. The procession moved out of the chapel toward the cemetery grounds, with Thomas leading the way, prayer book in hand. Michael fell into step beside him. "Something isn't right," he murmured. "I've never seen these people before, and I know most of the regular visitors." "Perhaps they're from out of town," Thomas suggested, though he shared Michael's unease. "And the plot location is wrong," Michael insisted. "I'm telling you, Father, Section E has been closed for new burials since the 1950s. As they approached Section E, Thomas was surprised to see a freshly dug grave. The earth was piled neatly to one side, the hole precisely the right dimensions for a casket. "I didn't dig this," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "No one on my team did." The pallbearers placed the casket on the straps suspended over the open grave. Thomas began the committal prayers, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness that prickled at the back of his neck. The mourners remained silent, their stillness unnatural. As Thomas spoke the final "Amen," one of the mourners stepped forward and placed a single black rose on top of the casket. The figure then turned toward Thomas, and for a brief moment the veil shifted, offering a glimpse of the face beneath. Thomas gasped involuntarily. The face was unnaturally pale, the eyes sunken and rimmed with dark shadows that couldn't be explained by makeup alone. But most disturbing was the expression, a knowing smile that held no warmth or humanity. The casket was lowered into the ground with mechanical precision. Instead of the usual handful of dirt, each mourner produced a small object from their pockets, what looked like carved stones with strange symbols, and tossed them onto the casket. Without waiting for the grave to be filled, the mourners turned and walked away in perfect unison, leaving Thomas and Michael standing alone by the open grave. "What just happened?" Thomas asked, his theological training offering no framework for the unsettling ceremony he had just witnessed. Michael's gaze remained fixed on the retreating figures. "I don't know," he admitted, "but in all my years here, I've never seen anything like it." He picked up a shovel that had been left propped against a nearby headstone. "I should fill the grave." "I'll help," Thomas offered, surprising himself. The thought of touching the dirt that would cover this particular casket filled him with dread, but leaving Michael alone felt wrong. As they worked in silence, the autumn sun began to disappear behind gathering clouds. A cold wind picked up, whistling through the nearby trees and carrying the first drops of rain. "We should talk," Michael said finally, patting down the last of the earth. "There's something about this burial, about Eleanor Blackwood. I need to check the records." Thomas nodded, feeling for the first time that his assignment to Oak Ridge Cemetery might have a purpose after all, one that had nothing to do with strengthening his spiritual foundation. Chapter 3: Buried Secrets. The cemetery office was housed in a small Victorian building near the main gates. Inside, decades of records were stored in aging filing cabinets and leather-bound ledgers. Michael knew the system intimately, having consulted these archives countless times during his tenure. Rain drummed against the windows as Michael pulled a heavy registry from a shelf. Father Thomas stood awkwardly by the door, his clerical collar suddenly feeling too tight. "The Blackwood family," Michael murmured, running his finger down a yellowed page. "Here we are. The family plot was established in 1892 by Cornelius Blackwood, a local industrialist." He continued reading, his brow furrowing. "According to this, Eleanor Blackwood was buried in 1947. She was 32 years old." "That can't be right," Thomas said, moving closer to examine the ledger. "The woman we buried today was 87. "Unless it's not the same Eleanor Blackwood," Michael suggested. He flipped through more pages, scanning entries. "There's no record of another Eleanor in the family line." Thomas shivered despite the office's warmth. Could the funeral home have made a mistake? Maxwell Funeral Home has been operating for generations. They don't make these kinds of mistakes. Michael closed the ledger and pulled out another book, this one containing maps of the cemetery sections. "Let me show you something." He opened to a detailed map of Section E, pointing to Plot 219. The Blackwood family mausoleum takes up plots 217 through 220. It was sealed after Eleanor's burial in 1947. No one should have been able to open it without proper authorization, which would have required my involvement. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. We need to go back there. Not tonight, Michael said firmly, glancing at the darkening sky outside. The rain's getting worse and Section E has poor drainage. We'll go first thing tomorrow morning. Thomas wanted to argue, but recognized the wisdom in Michael's caution. Instead, he asked, "What do you know about the Blackwoods?" Michael closed the map book and leaned back in his chair. They were one of the founding families of the town, made their fortune in coal mining and later diversified into manufacturing. The last direct descendant died in the 1970s, a nephew named William who never married. After that, the family properties were sold off or abandoned. What about the house? Is it still standing? Blackwood Manor. It's about 3 miles from here up on Ravens Hill. Been empty for decades. The Historical Society tried to preserve it, but there wasn't enough money. Last I heard, it was falling apart. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Michael pulled one more book from the shelves. A collection of local newspaper clippings and obituaries related to burials at Oak Ridge. He flipped through until he found what he was looking for. "Here's Eleanor Blackwood's obituary from 1947, he said, turning the book so Thomas could see. The faded photograph showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and a solemn expression. The obituary was brief, stating only that Eleanor Blackwood had passed away suddenly at her family home and was preceded in death by her parents and survived by her cousin William. No cause of death mentioned, Thomas noted. That was common back then when the circumstances were difficult, Michael said carefully. In those days, suicides and certain illnesses carried stigma. Thomas studied the photograph more closely. Something about Eleanor's eyes seemed familiar, but he couldn't place why. Is there any way to find out more about her? The town library might have more information, Michael suggested. They keep archives of the old local newspaper. Or, he hesitated, or what? Maggie Pearson. She's 97 now, lives at Shady Pines Retirement Home. Her father worked as a gardener for the Blackwoods. She used to come with him sometimes when he tended their grounds. If anyone would know the family stories, it would be her. Thomas nodded slowly. I'll visit her tomorrow after we check the mausoleum. As they prepared to leave, the office phone rang. Michael answered, his expression growing increasingly confused as he listened. Yes, I understand, but that's impossible. Yes, sir, first thing tomorrow. He hung up, his face pale. What is it? Thomas asked. That was Mr. Peterson, the cemetery director. He just received a call from Maxwell Funeral Home. They're scheduled to conduct a funeral tomorrow morning. Michael swallowed hard. For Eleanor Blackwood, age 87. But we just buried her today, Thomas protested. According to Peterson, Maxwell has no record of conducting any service today. Their paperwork shows Eleanor Blackwood died yesterday in Shady Pines Retirement Home, and her funeral is scheduled for tomorrow at 11 a.m. The implications hung in the air between them. If Maxwell hadn't conducted today's service, who were the mourners they had seen? Whose casket had they buried in the Blackwood plot? We need to go back to the grave, Thomas said urgently. Now. This time, Michael didn't argue. They gathered flashlights from the maintenance closet and pulled on raincoats. The storm had intensified, sheets of rain reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. They trudged through puddles and mud, their lights casting eerie shadows among the tombstones. Section E was located in the oldest part of the cemetery, where ancient trees loomed over elaborate Victorian monuments. The narrow paths between plots had turned to streams in the heavy rain, making progress difficult. There, Michael pointed ahead to where the Blackwood mausoleum should be. His flashlight beam illuminated the stone structure, its classical design featuring columns and a pediment inscribed with the family name. But as they drew closer, both men stopped in shock. The freshly dug grave they had filled just hours ago was now a smooth, undisturbed patch of grass, as if no one had ever broken the ground. More disturbing still, the mausoleum door, which Michael knew had been sealed for decades, stood slightly ajar. "This isn't possible," Michael whispered. "I filled that grave myself." Thomas moved toward the mausoleum door, an inexplicable compulsion driving him forward despite his fear. Michael followed reluctantly, his flashlight beam dancing across the wet stone. The heavy iron door creaked as Thomas pushed it wider, revealing a small chamber containing 6 stone sarcophagi. 5 bore plaques identifying the Blackwood family members entombed within. The 6th, positioned directly beneath a stained glass window depicting an angel, was different. Its lid was askew, pushed aside just enough to reveal that the sarcophagus was empty. On the floor beside it lay a single black rose, identical to the one placed on the casket during the strange funeral service. And scrawled on the inside of the sarcophagus lid in what looked disturbingly like dried blood were 3 words. "She is returned." Chapter 4, Voices from the Past. Thomas barely slept that night, his dreams filled with the image of the empty sarcophagus and those 3 chilling words. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a mist that clung to the tombstones like ghostly shrouds. He met Michael at the cemetery gates at 7, both men haggard from their disturbed night. "I called Peterson," Michael said without preamble. "Told him we needed to postpone today's funeral. He wasn't happy, but I convinced him we might have a case of mistaken identity." "Did you tell him what we found?" Michael shook his head. "Would you have believed me? We need more information before we start talking about empty graves and mysterious funeral services that apparently never happened." They drove in silence to Shady Pines retirement home, a pleasant brick building surrounded by well-tended gardens. The receptionist directed them to a sunroom where Maggie Pearson sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket over her knees despite the room's warmth. "Miss Pearson," Thomas approached carefully. "I'm Father Thomas Riley from Oak Ridge Chapel, and this is Michael Kane, the cemetery groundskeeper. We'd like to ask you about the Blackwood family, if you don't mind." Maggie's cloudy eyes sharpened with interest. "The Blackwoods. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years." Her voice was surprisingly strong for her age. "Sit down, Father. You too, Mr. Kane. My father worked for them for 30 years. Terrible family. Wealthy but terrible." Thomas exchanged a glance with Michael as they took seats opposite her. "We're particularly interested in a leaner Blackwood," he said gently. Maggie's expression changed, a shadow crossing her face. Poor Alina. She didn't deserve what happened to her. "And what was that exactly?" Michael prompted when she fell silent. Maggie leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "They said she killed herself. Jumped from the tower room window at Blackwood Manor. But my father, he didn't believe it. He said there was too much blood for just a fall." Thomas felt a chill, despite the warm sunroom. What did he think happened? He never said directly. Wasn't safe to accuse the Blackwoods of anything in those days. But he told me once, "Maggie, girl, remember this. Powerful men do terrible things when they think no one's watching." And he quit working for them right after Alina died, even though he had no other job lined up. She paused, her gnarled fingers plucking at her blanket. "Alina was kind to me. Let me play in the gardens when my father worked. She wasn't like the rest of them." "The rest of who?" Michael asked. "The Blackwood Circle," Maggie replied, her voice dropping even lower. "That's what my father called them. Family members and other wealthy folks from town. They held meetings at the manor, always on the dark moon. Very secretive." Thomas leaned forward. "Miss Pearson, did you know another Alina Blackwood? Someone who might still have been alive recently?" Maggie looked confused. No, there was only one Alina. The family name died with William in the 70s. A woman named Alina Blackwood supposedly died at this facility yesterday, Michael explained. Age 87. Maggie shook her head firmly. No Alina Blackwood here. I know every resident. There's an Alina Jenkins in the East Wing, but she's 92 and still very much alive. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Why are you really asking about the Blackwoods, father? Thomas hesitated, then decided honesty might yield more information. Something strange happened at the cemetery yesterday. A funeral for an Alina Blackwood that no one seems to have record of. Maggie's face paled. What date is it? October 17th, Michael replied, puzzled by the question. Mother of God, Maggie whispered, making the sign of the cross. It's been exactly 75 years. Since what? Thomas asked. Since Alina died, October 17, 1947. Maggie clutched Thomas's hand suddenly, her grip surprisingly strong. You need to stay away from Blackwood Manor, father. Both of you. Nothing good comes from stirring up the past. As they left Shady Pines, Thomas felt more unsettled than before. We need to see the death certificate, he said as they got into Michael's truck. Find out who authorized this funeral. Courthouse opens at 9, Michael replied, checking his watch. We have time to visit the library first. See what we can find about Alina's death in the newspaper archives. The town library was housed in a Carnegie building downtown. The archivist, a young woman named Denise, was eager to help once they explained their interest in local history. She led them to a microfilm reader loaded with copies of the town newspaper from 1947. October 18th should have the first report, she said, showing them how to advance the film. The headline was smaller than they expected. Local woman dies in tragic accident. The article briefly mentioned that Alina Blackwood, 32, had died at her family home, with funeral services to be private. No details about the circumstances were provided. That's it? Thomas asked, disappointed. Small towns, powerful families, Michael murmured. The Blackwoods probably controlled the newspaper. They continued searching and found a more detailed article a week later, buried on page 6. Questions raised about Blackwood death. It reported that a housemaid had come forward with claims that Alina's death was not as it seemed, but that the police had determined there was insufficient evidence to investigate further. The maid, Maria Gonzalez, had apparently left town shortly thereafter. This supports what Maggie's father suspected, Thomas said. Something wasn't right about Alina's death. They thanked Denise and headed to the courthouse, where they requested the death certificate for the Alina Blackwood supposedly scheduled for burial that day. The clerk returned looking perplexed. I'm sorry, but we have no death certificate for any Alina Blackwood in our recent records, she informed them. Are you sure you have the name right? Michael frowned. Maxwell Funeral Home is scheduled to conduct her funeral today. They must have a death certificate. The clerk shrugged. They would have filed it with us. We have nothing. Their next stop was Maxwell Funeral Home, an elegant Victorian house converted for its somber purpose. The director, Albert Maxwell, greeted them in his office. Father Riley, Mr. Kane, he nodded politely. I understand there's some confusion about today's service. Mr. Maxwell, we were told you have a funeral scheduled today for Alina Blackwood, Thomas said. But the courthouse has no death certificate, and Shady Pines has no record of a resident by that name. Maxwell frowned and turned to his computer. That's strange. Let me check our system. He typed for a moment, then looked up in confusion. You're right. There's no Alina Blackwood in our schedule for today or any day this week. Yet I distinctly remember receiving instructions. He trailed off, looking troubled. Instructions from whom? Michael pressed. Maxwell seemed genuinely perplexed. I can't recall. How very odd. As they left the funeral home, Thomas felt a growing sense of dread. Someone went to elaborate lengths to create the illusion of a funeral that never happened, using a name from the past. But why? Michael asked as they got back into his truck. And what does it have to do with the empty sarcophagus? Thomas stared out the window at the town below them. I think we need to visit Blackwood Manor. Michael grimaced, but turned the truck toward Raven's Hill. The road grew narrower and less maintained as they climbed, branches scraping against the vehicle's sides. Finally, they rounded a bend and Blackwood Manor came into view. The massive Victorian mansion had clearly once been magnificent, with towers, gables, and expansive verandas. Now it stood in haunting decay, its paint peeled away by decades of neglect, windows broken or boarded up, sections of the roof collapsed. An ornate wrought iron fence surrounded the property, the gate hanging off its hinges. As they pulled up to the entrance, Thomas noticed something unexpected. "Tire tracks," he said, pointing to the muddy driveway. "Recent ones." "We're not the first visitors today," Michael observed grimly. They approached the front door cautiously. To their surprise, it was unlocked, swinging open with a mournful creak at Michael's touch. The entrance hall beyond was grand even in decay, with a sweeping staircase and tarnished chandelier. Dust covered everything except. "Look," Thomas pointed to the floor, "footprints." Multiple sets of prints led through the dust, heading toward a doorway on the right. They followed cautiously, finding themselves in what had once been a library. Empty shelves lined the walls, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one end of the room. The footprints led to the fireplace, then disappeared. Michael ran his hands over the ornate mantelpiece. There could be a hidden mechanism. Old houses like this often had secret passages. As his fingers pressed a carved rosette, a grinding sound emerged from the fireplace. The back wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "I don't like this," Michael muttered, but Thomas was already reaching for his flashlight. The stairs led down to a large underground chamber that must have extended well beyond the house's foundation. Unlike the decaying mansion above, this space showed signs of recent use. Candles in ornate holders lined the walls, their wax still soft. A stone altar stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of strange symbols carved into the floor. And on the altar lay a familiar black-covered book. Thomas approached it slowly, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The cover bore no title, only an embossed symbol matching those they had seen the mysterious mourners drop into the grave. "Don't touch it," Michael warned, but Thomas was already reaching for the book, his fingers brushing the cover. The moment he made contact, the candles around the room flared to life, though no one had lit them. A cold wind whipped through the chamber, carrying whispers that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. And among those whispers, one voice rose more clearly than the rest, a woman's voice, young and afraid. "Help me." Chapter 5. The Final Resting Place. Thomas's hand jerked back from the book as if burned. The voice had been as clear as if someone stood beside him, yet he and Michael were alone in the chamber. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Michael nodded, his face ashen. "We should leave now." But Thomas couldn't move, his gaze fixed on the book. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten text in faded ink. The first page bore a single line, "The Journal of Eleanor Blackwood." "It's her diary," Thomas breathed. "Take it and let's go," Michael urged, glancing nervously at the staircase. Someone could return any moment. Thomas slipped the journal into his coat pocket, and they hurried back up the stairs. As they emerged into the library, a loud crash from the entrance hall froze them in place. "Someone's here," Michael whispered. They ducked behind a rotting desk as footsteps approached the library. Through a gap in the furniture, Thomas glimpsed black clothing and caught fragments of hushed conversation. "It must be completed by midnight." 75 years to the minute. She will rise again. The voices moved away, heading up the main staircase. Michael motioned toward a side door, and they slipped out, making their way through what had once been a music room and out a broken window onto a weed-choked terrace. They circled around to Michael's truck, keeping low and using overgrown shrubbery for cover. Once inside, Michael started the engine and drove quickly down the hill, neither speaking until they were well away from the manor. "What the hell is going on?" Michael finally broke the silence. Secret chambers, mysterious voices, people talking about someone rising again. Thomas pulled the journal from his pocket. "I think the answers might be in here." He opened it carefully, scanning the early entries. It starts in 1946. Alina was 31 then, unmarried, living with her uncle Cornelius after her parents died. He continued reading silently as Michael drove, his expression growing increasingly troubled. According to this, Alina discovered her uncle was the leader of something called the Order of the Eternal Night. They were conducting rituals in that underground chamber, attempting to contact entities from beyond our reality. "What kind of entities?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. "She doesn't say exactly. She calls them the Ancient Ones or those who wait beyond the veil." She was horrified, especially when she learned they were planning to use her in some kind of ritual. Thomas flipped forward through the pages. The entries get increasingly frantic. She tried to escape, to alert authorities, but the order controlled everything in town. The final entry, dated October 16, 1947, was brief and chilling. "They know I've discovered everything. I've locked myself in the tower room, but they're coming. If anyone finds this journal, know that what they plan goes beyond mere murder. They intend to bind my soul through death, to create a vessel for something inhuman. The ritual requires 75 years to complete, culminating in a return on the anniversary of the sacrifice. God forgive them, for I cannot." Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking. She knew they were going to kill her, and whatever they did, it somehow involved her returning after 75 years, which is today. Michael pulled the truck over suddenly, turning to face Thomas. "The funeral yesterday wasn't real. It was some kind of ritual, the first step in whatever they're trying to complete by midnight. And the real Alina Blackwood is scheduled to be buried today," Thomas added, the pieces falling into place. "They created a false identity, waiting all these years for someone of the right age to die near the anniversary, so they could use the burial as cover for the final stage." "We need to stop them," Michael said firmly. "How? We barely understand what's happening, and the police would never believe us." Michael thought for a moment. "We need to secure Alina's actual body first, make sure they can't use it for whatever they're planning." They drove to Maxwell Funeral Home, where they convinced a confused Albert Maxwell to show them the preparation room. The casket prepared for today's service stood on a wheeled bier, its polished oak surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "This is highly irregular," Maxwell protested, as Thomas requested to see the body. "It's a matter of spiritual significance," Thomas insisted, invoking his clerical authority. "Please, Mr. Maxwell." Reluctantly, Maxwell opened the casket. Inside lay the body of an elderly woman, her white hair arranged neatly around a face peaceful in death. A small card attached to the inner lining identified her as Jane Doe, not Alina Blackwood. "Who is this woman?" Thomas demanded. Maxwell appeared genuinely bewildered. I don't understand. The paperwork said Alina Blackwood. I prepared her myself yesterday." "Where did the body come from?" Michael asked. "The county morgue, unclaimed for 3 weeks. We were contacted by a law firm representing the Blackwood estate, saying they'd identified her as a distant relative." Maxwell rubbed his forehead. "But now that you mention it, I can't recall which law firm." Thomas exchanged a meaningful look with Michael. "Mr. Maxwell, it's imperative that this body remains secure. Can you lock it in your storage facility and not release it to anyone but us?" "I suppose," Maxwell agreed, clearly unsettled. "But what's going on?" "We're not entirely sure," Thomas admitted. "But I believe someone is attempting to desecrate Oak Ridge Cemetery for unholy purposes." After ensuring the Jane Doe was secured in Maxwell's refrigerated storage, they returned to Michael's truck. "They'll realize their plan has been disrupted when the funeral doesn't proceed," Michael said. "What do we do about the mausoleum? We still don't know what happened to Alina's remains from 1947. Thomas thought of the empty sarcophagus and the blood-written message. "I think I understand now. The ritual they performed yesterday was meant to call Alina's spirit back to the cemetery. Today's funeral was supposed to provide a body for that spirit to inhabit." "So where is her spirit now?" Michael asked uneasily. Thomas clutched the journal. "According to Alina's last entry, they bound her soul in death. I think she's been trapped all these years, possibly in the mausoleum itself. And the empty sarcophagus was where her body should have been," Thomas finished. "We need to find her remains and give them proper consecration. That might free her spirit and disrupt whatever the order is planning." The cemetery was quiet when they arrived, the afternoon sun casting long shadows among the tombstones. They made their way directly to the Blackwood mausoleum, which stood as they had left it, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the empty sarcophagus remained exposed. Thomas approached it carefully, examining the inscription on the plaque. "Alina Blackwood, 1915 to 1947, beloved daughter." "Look at this," Michael called from the corner of the mausoleum. He was kneeling beside a section of flooring where the stone appeared slightly different. "This has been replaced more recently than the rest." Working together, they managed to pry up the stone slab, revealing a small space beneath. Inside was a metal box, corroded with age. Thomas lifted it out, feeling its surprising weight. "Should we open it?" Michael asked. Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to know." The lid creaked as he raised it. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating fabric, were human bones, a complete skeleton carefully arranged. "Alina," Thomas whispered. They hid her real remains under the floor and placed an empty casket in the sarcophagus. Michael crossed himself. "We need to place her back where she belongs and seal the mausoleum properly." As Thomas reached into the box to lift the remains, his fingers brushed against something hard beneath the bones. He carefully moved aside the skeleton to reveal another book, smaller than the journal but bound in the same black material. "The ritual manual," he breathed, opening it carefully. "Instructions for binding a soul and preparing for the great summoning." He scanned the pages quickly. According to this, they needed Alina's spirit trapped for 75 years, gathering power. Today, at midnight, they intend to conduct the final ritual at the manor, using her spirit as a gateway to allow something through from the other side. "What happens if they succeed?" Michael asked. Thomas's expression was grim as he read further. "Nothing good. References to darkness covering the land, the dead rising, the ancient ones reclaiming the earth. So we need to free Alina's spirit before midnight," Michael concluded. "How do we do that?" Thomas flipped through the ritual manual. "There's a counter-ritual here, intended to be used if the binding needed to be broken for any reason. It requires returning the remains to their proper resting place, a blessing from a man of faith, and," he paused, "the destruction of a focus object that contains part of the bound soul." "What object?" Thomas looked up from the book. "I don't know. Something important to Alina, something that would have been used in the original binding ritual." Michael's eyes widened suddenly. "The black rose. There was one on the casket yesterday and another in the mausoleum last night. Roses must have been significant to her," Thomas agreed. "But we don't have—" "Wait," Michael interrupted. "When I started working here, there was a rosebush growing against the back of the mausoleum. Black roses, an unusual variety. Old Mr. Simmons, the groundskeeper before me, said it had been planted the day after Alina's funeral and that it never died, even in winter." They hurried outside and around to the back of the mausoleum. There, just as Michael had described, grew a rosebush with dark blooms that appeared almost black in the fading light. "This has to be it," Thomas said. "The focus object, sustaining the binding for 75 years. As the sun began to set, they worked quickly. Michael carefully transferred Alina's remains to the sarcophagus, while Thomas prepared for the counter-ritual, using elements from the manual combined with traditional Catholic prayers. When everything was ready, Thomas stood before the open sarcophagus, Alina's journal and the ritual manual on a small table beside him. Michael had uprooted the rosebush entirely, its roots wrapped in burlap. "We should begin," Thomas said, glancing at his watch. "It's nearly 8 and we don't know how long this will take." He began reciting the prayers, first in Latin and then in English, asking for Alina's soul to be released from its unnatural bondage. As he spoke, the air in the mausoleum grew colder, and the flames of the candles they had brought flickered despite the absence of any breeze. "In nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti," Thomas intoned, making the sign of the cross over Alina's remains. "By the authority granted to me as a servant of God, I release you, Alina Blackwood, from all bonds not of divine making. May your soul find the peace that was denied you in life." Michael stepped forward with the rosebush. Following Thomas's instructions, he placed it on a small stone altar they had prepared, then poured salt and consecrated oil over it. "With the destruction of this focus," Thomas continued, "we sever the ties that bind spirit to earth against its will." He struck a match and touched it to the oil-soaked roots. The flames caught quickly, spreading throughout the plant. As the fire consumed the rosebush, a high, keening sound filled the mausoleum, like a distant wail of mingled pain and relief. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Above the sarcophagus, the air shimmered and coalesced into a faint, translucent form, the silhouette of a young woman. Thomas continued the ritual, his voice never faltering despite his awe. "Alina Blackwood, your remains are returned to their rightful place. Your binding is broken. You are free to journey beyond the veil, where those who sought to use you cannot reach." The spectral figure seemed to look directly at Thomas, then at Michael. A voice echoed in their minds rather than their ears. "Thank you, but it isn't over. They're still coming. The circle remains unbroken at the manor." "What can we do?" Thomas asked aloud. "Destroy the altar in the chamber. Without it their gateway cannot open." The apparition began to fade. "Hurry, they gather even now." With a final flicker, Alina's spirit disappeared. The flames consuming the rosebush died suddenly, leaving nothing but ash. Thomas and Michael sealed the sarcophagus and mausoleum door, working quickly in the growing darkness. By the time they finished, night had fallen completely. "We have to go back to the manor," Thomas said grimly. "Finish what we started." Michael nodded, his weathered face resolute. "I've spent my life caring for the dead, making sure they rest in peace. I won't let anyone disturb that peace, not while I'm still breathing." They drove up Raven's Hill for the second time that day, but now they came prepared. In addition to flashlights, they carried tools from Michael's groundskeeping shed, a sledgehammer, picks, and a crowbar, along with holy water and blessed salt from the chapel. Blackwood Manor loomed against the night sky, several windows now glowing with flickering light. They parked some distance away and approached on foot, careful to avoid the main entrance. Michael led them to a servant's door he had spotted earlier, and they slipped inside undetected. They could hear chanting coming from the library. Peering carefully around the doorframe, They saw a dozen figures in black robes gathered around the open passage to the underground chamber, candles in hand. As they watched, the group began descending the stone staircase. "We need to wait until they're all below," Michael whispered. Once the last robed figure had disappeared, they moved quickly to the fireplace. The passage remained open. Thomas led the way down the stairs, moving as quietly as possible. The chanting grew louder as they neared the bottom. Thomas stopped just before the final turn, where they could see without being seen. In the chamber, the robed figures had formed a circle around the altar, which now glowed with an unearthly blue light. One figure stood at the center, arms raised, reading from a book similar to the one Thomas had found. "By blood bound and by time strengthened," the leader intoned. "On this night, as promised, we release what was contained. Eleanor Blackwood, vessel of our will, open the way." Thomas recognized the ritual from the manual. They were attempting to call Eleanor's spirit to complete the gateway. But thanks to their earlier actions, she would not come. After several minutes of increasingly desperate invocations, the leader lowered his arms. "Something is wrong." She does not answer. Another robed figure stepped forward. "The vessel must have been disturbed. We should check the mausoleum." "There's no time," the leader snapped. "Midnight approaches. We will proceed with the alternative method." He gestured, and two followers brought forward a struggling figure, a young woman, bound and gagged. Thomas felt sick as he realized they had a backup plan, another sacrifice. "Now," he whispered to Michael, unable to wait any longer. They emerged from the stairwell with a shout. Thomas splashed holy water across the circle of symbols on the floor, breaking its continuity, while Michael charged toward the altar, sledgehammer raised. The robed figures reacted with shouts of alarm. Several moved to intercept Michael, but years of physical labor had made the groundskeeper stronger than his age might suggest. He swung the sledgehammer in a wide arc, forcing them back, then brought it down on the edge of the stone altar with all his might. A crack appeared in the ancient stone, and the blue glow flickered. The leader screamed in rage, producing a knife from within his robes and lunging toward Thomas. Thomas dodged, still reciting prayers and scattering blessed salt across the symbols. Two robed figures grabbed him from behind, but he fought free, driven by righteous fury. Michael struck the altar again, and the crack widened. The blue light pulsed erratically now, and a wind began to swirl through the chamber, extinguishing candles. "Stop them!" the leader shrieked, but it was too late. With a third mighty blow, Michael split the altar down the middle. The blue light exploded outward in a blinding flash, then vanished completely. A deafening rumble shook the chamber, and dust and small stones began to rain from the ceiling. "The place is coming down," Michael shouted, grabbing the bound young woman and hauling her toward the stairs. Thomas followed, pausing only to snatch the ritual book from where the leader had dropped it. The robed figures scattered in panic as larger stones began to fall. Thomas and Michael raced up the stairs, the young woman between them, as the underground chamber collapsed behind them. They barely made it out of the manor before sections of the floor began caving in, the foundation destabilized by the destruction below. They didn't stop running until they reached Michael's truck. As they drove away, Thomas looked back to see Blackwood Manor silhouetted against the night sky, sections of the roof and walls crumbling inward as the ground beneath it gave way. Within minutes, little remained but a pile of rubble on Raven's Hill. They took the young woman, a student from the local community college who had been abducted earlier that day, to the hospital, making up a story about finding her on the roadside. Once they were sure she would recover, they returned to Oak Ridge Cemetery. Dawn was breaking as they stood before the Blackwood Mausoleum. Thomas had performed a final blessing, formally consecrating Eleanor's remains and sealing the crypt properly. "What will you do with the books?" Michael asked, nodding toward the journal and ritual manual that Thomas still carried. Thomas considered for a moment. Study them, learn from them, then destroy them. Knowledge like this is dangerous, but ignorance can be equally so. Michael nodded in understanding. And the bodies in the manor ruins. Anonymous tips to the police, Thomas said. They'll be found but without context. The Order's secrets will remain buried with them. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise over the cemetery. The tombstones, which had seemed ominous in darkness, now looked peaceful in the golden morning light. You know, Michael said finally, in all my years tending this place, I always believed I was caring for the dead. Now I realize I was also protecting the living. Thomas smiled. Perhaps that's what we're all meant to do in our own ways. Honor those who came before, while ensuring they rest in the peace they deserve. He placed a hand on the mausoleum door, feeling a sense of completion. Rest well, Eleanor. No one will disturb you again. As they walked back through the cemetery, Thomas realized he no longer felt out of place among the graves. His assignment to Oak Ridge, which had seemed like a punishment, now felt like a calling. These grounds were sacred in their own way, a boundary between worlds that needed guardians. And in Michael, the humble groundskeeper who had devoted his life to tending the dead, Thomas had found not just an ally but a teacher, someone who understood that true honor lay in the quiet, daily work of remembrance. Together, they would continue their respective duties, Michael cleaning the graves and maintaining the grounds, Thomas offering prayers and comfort. But now they shared a deeper purpose, protecting the boundary between life and death, ensuring that each soul found its proper rest. In Oak Ridge Cemetery, amid the whispers among tombstones, they had found their true vocation. The end.